Have you ever followed someone's lead, not because they were skilled, but because there was something honest in the way they moved? Tonight's story isn't about perfect timing or flawless steps. It's about a little boy whose dance didn't follow any rules, and a waitress who chose to follow anyway. But before we begin, if you've ever been led by someone the world overlooked, if you've ever learned something real from someone who didn't get it right, hit that like button and leave a comment. Who's the one person you followed, even when they weren't sure of the steps? Because sometimes, being brave isn't about teaching, it's about letting someone else lead, even when the rhythm feels all wrong. Now, let's begin. Some people dance well. Some people teach others how to dance. And some are brave enough to be taught a dance no one's ever seen before. It was a Thursday night at a high-end restaurant tucked into the quieter side of town. The lights were dim just enough to invite softness, warmth, and a hint of curiosity. A small chalkboard near the door read in playful cursive, "Free step night, let someone teach you their rhythm." It wasn't meant to be serious. Just something fun, whimsical, even. Diners were encouraged to pair up randomly, take a few steps together in whatever style one partner chose. You teach. I follow. Then we switch. A charming concept for a crowd with glasses of wine in hand. Everett Hale, 61, sat near the window, watching it all unfold with the controlled gaze of someone used to systems. A billionaire investor in educational platforms, Everett had spent his life optimizing pathways, mental, physical, emotional, for achievement. Every child could learn. Every skill could be mastered. He believed in frameworks, in structure, in measurable outcomes. He believed deeply that growth was a map you could draw. His son Mason, 9 years old, stood beside him quietly. The boy had a curvature in his spine, subtle, but enough that it shaped the way he moved. His back leaned unevenly, and his steps carried a hesitant sway. He'd never been chosen for team sports. In school plays, he was the background tree, or the silent sheep. People smiled at him with sympathy, not curiosity. He had learned early to shrink himself before others had to. Talia, 27, moved gracefully through the room balancing drinks on a tray. Her limbs had once memorized modern dance, fluid, fearless. But years of injury had taught her the hard lesson of stillness. She worked here now, not because she gave up on movement, but because she was still learning to love it without pain. She didn't perform anymore. She listened. Mason watched her. She didn't speak much, but when she walked between tables, there was something deliberate in her pace, like she was listening for a rhythm no one else could hear. She wasn't just carrying drinks. She was noticing. "Can I show you my dance?" Mason asked, so softly only she could hear. She looked at him, not down at him, but straight level, without adjusting her smile into something patronizing. She didn't say "Sure, buddy," or "How cute." Instead, she set her tray on a nearby ledge. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't glance at her manager. She just bent slightly at the waist, extended her hand, and said quietly, "You lead." That one moment cracked something open in the room. Not loudly. Not with any drama. But if you were paying attention, you could feel it. In the background, Everett froze. Not out of disapproval, but confusion. He wasn't used to that phrase, not with Mason. You lead. Those two words didn't belong in the vocabulary surrounding his son. Mason didn't lead. Mason learned. That was the unspoken arrangement. But now, Talia wasn't correcting. She wasn't coaching. She wasn't preparing Mason for success. She was offering him a role no one had ever given him. The boy raised his arm, bent at the elbow in a crooked motion that looked more like a flinch than a flourish. His foot dragged slightly to the left, and his shoulders followed with a stuttering rhythm. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't clean. But Talia moved with him. Not to fix the steps. Not to make them prettier. She simply mirrored. One step behind, with an openness that turned every irregular movement into something deliberate. In the quiet air, as the rest of the restaurant buzzed with conversation and silverware, a new kind of dance unfolded, imperfect, yes, but whole in a way that no choreography could script. Everett watched his son, not with pride or pity, but with something more vulnerable. A kind of recognition. Mason wasn't just participating. He was being followed. And the woman following him wasn't just being kind. She was surrendering control. Mason's first step wasn't elegant. His left foot slid too far, turning his hip awkwardly. His right arm curled outward, wrist bent, elbow stiff, an angle that suggested more instinct than intention. It looked broken, untrained, like a movement caught between impulse and hesitation. But Talia didn't flinch. She didn't reach out to adjust his arm. She didn't smile the way adults often do when a child tries and fails. She didn't say, "Try again," or almost. She didn't even nod. She just moved. One beat behind him, she mirrored the crooked step. Her arm arced the same odd angle. Her hip dipped just as suddenly. Her foot followed his, letting it lead the rhythm, no matter how off-tempo it felt. And she made it look like a choice. Mason paused after the second turn. He looked up at her, his face tight, not with fear, but with a self-consciousness children know too well. His lips pressed together. Then he said it, barely audible. "That's wrong." Talia didn't stop moving. She simply replied, without missing a beat. "I'm following. So it's right." It was the kind of sentence that doesn't ask to be explained. It just rests in the air, quietly rearranging the rules around it. At the far end of the restaurant, a couple glanced over. They had noticed the boy's strange rhythm, the waitress twirling oddly behind him, and whispered something that ended with a soft chuckle. Another server walking past gave a brief shrug, her expression unreadable but just long enough to register disapproval. But neither Mason nor Talia looked away. The boy began again, this time shifting his weight onto his right foot, bending his knees into a slight bounce before spinning, not fully, just enough to make his balance falter. Talia caught the rhythm mid-stumble and spun too, deliberately letting her step echo the imbalance. She was practicing the dance of following, not fixing. And Mason, for perhaps the first time in any public space, kept going. Not faster, not cleaner, just, with less apology. He extended his arm again, bent it awkwardly, tilted his shoulder into a motion that seemed to resist every convention of posture. Talia followed it like choreography. She didn't smooth the edges. She didn't make it graceful. She honored the imperfection by repeating it. And that made it beautiful. There's something that happens when a mistake is treated like a pattern. It starts to feel like language, like meaning. And in that quiet corner of the room, Mason was beginning to speak. No one clapped. No spotlight found them. There was no music, no tempo, not even the synchronized movements that might suggest real dancing. But for those who were watching, and there were more than a few now, something had shifted. A small girl at a neighboring table looked up from her spaghetti and tilted her head, mimicking Mason's arm in the air. Her mother gently put a hand on her wrist and guided it down, whispering something about not staring. But Mason didn't notice. He was looking at Talia, and she was still with him. He tried a new move, raising both hands and letting them drop suddenly, like leaves falling from a tree. It was too fast. Talia was half a second behind. But she dropped her arms anyway, laughing softly. Not at him but with him, as if she too was surprised by the direction he'd chosen. And for the first time in the evening, Mason smiled, not because someone praised him, but because someone trusted him. His body didn't need to be corrected. It needed to be echoed. Talia stepped closer, barely, and tilted her shoulder the same way his had twitched moments before. It wasn't just mimicry. It was validation. And in that instant, Mason didn't feel observed. He felt understood. Across the restaurant, the chatter resumed. The moment didn't end with applause or attention. It ended quietly, just as it had begun. But something had been offered. A kind of space. A kind of stillness. The kind of opportunity that can only exist when someone chooses not to teach, not to polish, not to guide, but simply to follow. Everett Hale had always believed that observation was power. He built an empire by watching systems, mapping out patterns, and refining them into something sharper, cleaner, more efficient. His life was built around the idea that with enough information, anything could be optimized. Especially people. He had applied this same logic to parenting. Mason's diagnosis, spinal curvature with implications for balance and movement, hadn't devastated him. It had merely presented a new problem to solve. Mr. Hale had read every medical article, hired specialists, enrolled his son in adaptive therapy. Everything had a plan. Progress could be charted. Deviations corrected. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. From his seat at the edge of the restaurant, glass of water in hand and untouched plate in front of him, Hale watched his son take a step that broke every rule of coordination. Mason's left leg bent outward in a sweeping curve, his knee rolling in a way that sent his weight stumbling slightly off balance. It was an exaggerated, lopsided move, almost like a child pretending to limp. He looked like he might fall. But he didn't. Instead, Talia followed. She didn't flinch. Her eyes never left Mason. She mimicked his step, her own knee turning awkwardly, her body shifting with an intentional clumsiness that matched his beat for beat. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't symmetrical. And yet, no part of her expression carried embarrassment. She moved like the mistake was part of the choreography. Everett's brows furrowed. He leaned forward, watching closer, waiting for the correction to come, the adult's subtle redirection, the gentle cue to help his son fix the dance. But it didn't come. Mason moved again, this time stepping backward while his arms jerked out in a motion that looked almost bird-like. Talia followed again, her arms flaring wide in unison, softening the motion but never altering its shape. No one said a word. No one guided. And for the first time, Everett felt disoriented. He turned slightly toward the bar, where Ben, the restaurant manager, stood adjusting glasses on a shelf. Everett cleared his throat and asked quietly, "She's letting him lead?" Ben glanced over, barely pausing in his movement. His tone was flat, neutral. Apparently. It wasn't said with approval or criticism, just observation. But for Everett, the implications landed heavy. Letting Mason lead meant relinquishing control. It meant surrendering the outcome. It meant accepting that something unrefined, something asymmetrical and potentially awkward, was allowed to take center stage. And worse, someone was treating it like it deserved to. His mind, trained for data and results, reeled. Mason had always needed assistance. Every therapist, every report, every program had emphasized support and intervention. Letting him lead? That wasn't just unconventional. It was negligent. Or so he'd believed. But then why did it look so, right? Hale's gaze returned to the pair on the floor. Mason was now spinning slowly, with uneven footing and a rhythm that defied musical timing. Talia mirrored him, not perfectly, but deliberately, staying with him instead of ahead of him. Her hands moved with a softness that reshaped every jagged motion into something that held weight. And then came the smallest detail. Mason glanced up. Not to check approval. Not to ask permission. But to connect. Everett saw it. That moment of unguarded recognition. The child looking to see if he was still being followed. If he was still being heard. And Talia answered not with words, but with motion. She nodded mid-step, barely, and shifted again in sync with his next movement. There it was, trust. Not given. Not demanded. But returned. It broke something in Everett's chest. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But like a hairline crack in a polished surface. A flaw he hadn't seen before because he never knew to look for it. This wasn't a performance. It was a conversation. and his son was leading it. He looked around the room. Most patrons had gone back to their meals. A few still watched, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. But no one interrupted. He suddenly wondered, had Mason ever been allowed to do this before? To move without adjusting? To be followed instead of guided? How many times had Everett told him to straighten his back, to slow down, to step carefully? How many times had he reshaped his son's movements to make them resemble something more typical, more acceptable? And now here was this young woman, unremarkable to anyone else, treating Mason's crooked rhythm as if it were the lead in a song no one else could hear. Everett felt a quiet panic rise, because for the first time, he wasn't needed. His knowledge didn't fit here. His strategies had no place. His presence was peripheral. He wasn't watching a child be guided. He was watching a child become. And Talia, without training guides or data models, had known exactly how to meet him there. No correction. No encouragement. Just following. The music had faded, or maybe it hadn't been there in the first place. Whatever rhythm Mason and Talia had followed didn't come from the speakers. It came from something else, something quieter and far less rehearsed. The dinner rush was winding down. Plates were cleared, silverware stacked. The energy of the restaurant had returned to its usual hum, background laughter, clinking glasses, the low murmur of conversation. But one table near the window remained still. Everett Hale hadn't touched his food. Mason sat beside him, a quiet flush on his cheeks that wasn't embarrassment, but something closer to relief. Behind the bar, Ben was organizing the register, his eyes darting occasionally toward Talia as she restacked menus at the host stand. There was tension in the air, not overt, but present, like static before a storm. He called her over with a small wave. Talia approached without hesitation. Her face was calm, unreadable. She didn't smile, didn't brace. Ben didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice was smooth, managerial, practiced in the art of sounding polite while sharpening the point. Next time, he said, don't make a show of it. Talia blinked once. A show? You had the whole room watching you. This isn't a stage. We're here to serve, not perform. Her hands rested loosely at her sides. She didn't protest. She didn't raise her voice or fold into apology. She didn't defend the boy or explain the moment. She asked one thing. Did he smile? Ben paused. It wasn't the question he expected. It wasn't rhetorical. She genuinely wanted to know. And for a brief second, his managerial armor cracked. He didn't answer. Because he had seen it. The way Mason had looked at her, not like a customer looking at a server, but like a student looking at someone who had just made space for his voice. That smile, rare and shy, had come from something deeper than fun. It had come from recognition. Talia didn't wait for Ben's response. She nodded once, a quiet gesture of understanding, and turned to walk away. Across the restaurant, Mason stood by the door with Everett. His small frame was silhouetted by the soft amber lighting. He lifted one arm in a crooked arc, mimicking the same off-balance spin he'd done earlier. He didn't say anything. He just raised the arm. Talia saw him. Without hesitation, she mirrored the gesture, right there behind the bar. Her arm lifted in the same imperfect arc. Her shoulder tilted. She didn't exaggerate it. She didn't wink. She just repeated the movement as if it were a cue from the most natural script. A couple near the counter noticed. One of them whispered something, smirking behind a napkin. Another server raised an eyebrow. But Talia didn't care. Because sometimes, doing something wrong wasn't about rebellion. It was about loyalty. Mason had taught her a step, imperfect, unmeasured, awkward. And she had followed. Now he was asking silently if she remembered. If she still meant it. And she answered not with words, but with motion. Ben saw it too. From behind the register, His fingers froze on the keys. The bar, the staff, the protocol, none of it had prepared him for that kind of courage. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't dramatic. But it was undeniable. Talia had chosen a side. Not against the restaurant. Not against him. But for someone. For the boy who had risked showing her something of himself. For the boy who had offered her leadership in a form the world didn't usually recognize. And in that moment, repeating his step wasn't just an echo, it was a promise. A quiet declaration that said, "I still trust you. I still believe your way matters." Ben looked down, said nothing, and returned to counting the drawer. The night moved on. Orders came in. Tables turned. But something lingered in the air, a ripple from a small imperfect movement that had been made sacred by repetition. The house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that amplifies every small sound. The creak of leather when Everett Hale sat down, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft, restless ticking of a clock he had always meant to replace. He sat at his desk, still wearing his blazer, though the night had long passed dinner hours. The tie was loosened. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if gravity had learned something new about him that evening. In front of him lay a leather-bound notebook. It wasn't decorative. It was functional, clean lines, soft grain, with evenly tabbed sections. The cover bore a small embossed stamp, Development Plan, MH. He opened it slowly. Each page inside had been meticulously filled. Charts. Observations. Weekly goals. Progress metrics. Exercises broken down into sequences. Therapist's notes, translated into action points. A blueprint, not just for mobility, but for Mason's entire journey. Everett had begun the notebook when Mason was 5, shortly after the diagnosis. It was how he coped, with logic, with order, with an unshakable belief that if he just followed the right steps, Mason would not only walk upright, but walk proud. The problem, of course, was that Mason hadn't followed the steps. At least not in the way Everett had envisioned. Tonight had proven that. The boy had moved in ways no program would have recommended, jerky, unsymmetrical, rhythmically unpredictable. And yet, people had followed him. A woman had trusted him. And Mason had smiled, not with victory, but with something gentler. Something that looked dangerously close to freedom. Everett flipped through the pages. His handwriting stared back at him in bold, tidy lines. Week 14, reinforce left side coordination through stair drills. Target, reduce hip compensation during extended gait. Do not allow uncorrected motion to persist, risk of habit formation. He paused. Then turned to the back of the notebook, where one blank page remained. For a long moment, he didn't write anything. His pen hovered. He looked down, then out the window, then back again. The silence pressed against him, heavy and expectant. And then, without ceremony, without planning, he wrote 2 lines. Step 1, let him teach. Step 2, follow. He stared at the words. There was no flourish. No summary of insights or data-backed analysis. Just 2 steps, simple, declarative, impossibly hard. Let him teach. Follow. He ran his finger across the ink, as if testing whether the letters would smudge, whether they were real. Then, without blinking, he reached forward and tore the page out, slowly, carefully. The rest of the notebook sat in his lap, years of notes, appointments, strategies. He closed it. Then opened it again. Page by page, he began to tear them out. Some resisted. Others gave way too easily. Each one released a sigh of paper as it left the binding. He didn't shred them in anger. This wasn't frustration. It was surrender. When he reached the end, only one page remained, the one in his hand. He folded it once, then again, until it was small enough to slip into the inside pocket of his blazer. And that was it. The rest, pages that had once represented direction, control, intention, were now stacked beside the waste bin in a silent heap. They hadn't been wrong. But they weren't right anymore. They belonged to a version of Everett that had believed his job was to lead, to fix, to shape. But the boy who danced tonight had no interest in being shaped. He wasn't broken. He was becoming. And for the first time, Everett understood that the greatest act of love might not be creating the plan, but letting go of it. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, hand resting over the folded page in his chest pocket. No applause. No victory speech. Just the steady rhythm of a father learning, quietly, finally, how to follow. 1 week later, the restaurant looked the same, but something in Everett Hale had changed. It was a Thursday again. Soft jazz played through the speakers. The floor had been freshly polished, tables reset with folded linen napkins and candlelit centerpieces. The familiar chalkboard by the entrance still read Free Step Night. Everett stood just past the threshold, one hand resting on the shoulder of his son. Mason was dressed in a light sweater, his shoes slightly scuffed from the sidewalk outside. He didn't hesitate. As soon as he spotted her, across the room, wiping down a table with deliberate care, his hand lifted in that unmistakable crooked arc. Talia looked up. She smiled, not the practiced smile of service, but the kind that came from recognition. She set her rag aside, stepped forward slowly, and nodded. Mason asked, without ceremony, "Ready to follow?" Talia tilted her head. Her reply was immediate. Always. She didn't glance at Everett. She didn't ask permission. She didn't even hesitate to step out from behind her station. Everett remained where he was, close enough to see everything, far enough to stay out of its way. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. This time, he knew the dance wasn't his. Mason raised his right leg, knee bending in the same wide arc as before. It was the same step, the off-balanced knee dip he had improvised the week prior. He added a small tilt of his head, then a sway of his shoulders that looked more like instinct than routine. Talia followed every beat. She mirrored the asymmetry like it was scripted. Her body moved with grace, but never tried to smooth over his choices. She allowed each movement to lead her, awkward, irregular, beautifully his. They didn't speak. They just moved, him a beat ahead, her a breath behind. A few nearby diners paused. Some recognized the boy from last week. A couple exchanged glances, unsure whether they were watching something rehearsed or spontaneous. But no one interrupted. From his place near the door, Everett watched with a stillness he had learned over time, not the rigid stillness of control, but the yielding kind that comes when you know you are no longer the center. His hand drifted up, resting over his chest, just above the pocket where he still carried that folded piece of paper. Step 1, let him teach. Step 2, follow. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. As Mason dipped again, knee bent, shoulders dropped, chin tilted, Everett found himself mimicking the movement barely. A subtle roll of the shoulder. A shift of the weight. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough to remember. He closed his eyes. In that moment, the lines between leader and follower dissolved. There was no choreography, no instructor, no student. Only rhythm. Only presence. Only trust. Mason glanced toward Talia once more. She was still with him. The boy smiled. There comes a point in life when you stop trying to lead every step, and begin to understand the quiet grace of following. This story wasn't about a boy who danced well. It was about a boy who danced honestly, and about the people who had the courage to move with him, not in front of him. And perhaps that's one of the most difficult lessons to learn, especially as we grow older, that not everything broken needs fixing. That sometimes, our job isn't to correct, but to stay close enough so someone else feels safe to keep moving. For many of us who have spent years parenting, guiding, mentoring, there's a deep instinct to protect, to improve, to ensure the next generation doesn't suffer the way we did. But in doing so, we often forget that growth isn't always symmetrical, and leadership isn't always about being the one with the answers. Mason's father, Everett, built his life on precision and plans. He thought love looked like preparation. He thought being present meant having the blueprint. But what his son needed wasn't another step to follow. It was someone brave enough to follow him. And Talia, a woman whose own dreams of dancing were left behind, became the one person willing to move to a rhythm that made no sense to anyone else, but made all the difference to a child who had never been allowed to lead. The real change didn't happen on the restaurant floor. It happened in the silence of a father's study, where a page once filled with years of planning was replaced by 2 simple steps. Let him teach. Follow. That's it. Letting go of control isn't weakness. It's trust. Following someone else's imperfect path doesn't mean you've lost your way. Sometimes it means you've finally found the courage to walk beside someone, on their terms. So if you've spent your life guiding others, maybe now is the time to ask, who are you willing to let lead? And what might you learn when you stop correcting and start listening? Because some of life's most meaningful dances don't come with music. They begin when we stop needing to be right and choose to simply be there. If you've ever learned something imperfect, not from a teacher, but from someone the world never saw as a guide. If someone once let you lead, not because you were the best, but because they didn't need you to be right, just brave enough to try, then remember this. Some dances aren't passed down. They're passed forward by those brave enough to follow. Like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments, who's the one person that ever let you teach them? Not because you proved yourself, but because they believed you mattered?